Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Go Ahead. I'm Deirdre Latour, and we have a very hot topic today. It's such a hot topic. It's going to be like The View, but without the fighting. We're not going to do any of the fighting. And the hot topic is, what should the role of business be in society? And in particular, when should CEOs speak up or put their head down and do the work of the company? So before I introduce my esteemed guest, in August 2019, the Business Roundtable put out a statement redefining the purpose of a corporation, a statement that was largely applauded and largely targeted at addressing income inequality. And wow, the world has changed since then. 2019 feels like 20 years ago at this point. So today I have a very special guest that will help me do a sort of master class on the topic of CEOs and company communications in a divided world. So I'm thrilled to introduce Jeff Immelt. Jeff is a venture partner at NEA on the technology and healthcare investing teams, and he's the author of Hot Seat, a memoir of leadership in times of crisis. Also, full disclosure, Jeff was my boss for 14 years at GE when he was CEO of GE, and I mentor so many people, Jeff, and everyone always says to me, how did you get to become an officer at GE? And the answer is Jeff Immelt, because the sponsorship that, yes, I worked hard, but the sponsorship that Jeff gave me for 14 years and how he relentlessly pushed women through the system at GE should not be underestimated. There are women all over this country that are thankful to that in big jobs at all sorts of companies. So he is forever will be one of the most important people in my career. So thanks for doing this, Jeff.
Thanks, Steve. You earned every bit of it.
Okay, great. So over the last 4 years, over the Trump administration, but especially the last two, CEOs have taken on a new role, I think, increased role as leaders, not just of businesses, but of our communities and of the country. And this has been kind of standard operating procedure for what we would call sort of liberal consumer brands like your Ben and Jerry's and Nike and Patagonia and tech companies. But now we see companies that used to shy away from this, talking about everything from social justice to voting laws, the Capitol insurrection. The list of companies is endless: Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, healthcare companies, PwC, and the language is often really strong. Michael Corbett at Citi said he was disgusted by the Capitol riots. Ed Bastian at Delta said the Georgia voting law was, quote unquote, unacceptable and based on a lie, and it did not match Delta's values. Now, these are all really smart leaders, obviously, so they know what we see in the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is people are expecting them to stand up on these issues. So the latest Trust Barometer data said 86% of people in the world that were polled expect companies to stand up on social issues, in particular CEOs. And 65% said that CEOs should hold themselves accountable to the public in issues. And 66% said CEOs should take the lead. So I guess as a starting point, Jeff, what happened to just put your head down and get your numbers?
You know, Dee, so it's great to be with you, first of all. Thanks and congrats on everything you've done. But look, the world's just changed. It's more complicated to be a business leader today than any time in history. I'm watching it more or less from the sidelines today, so it's hard to watch. But I would say, in addition to all the technical disruption and globalization and things that have been going on for a long time, I think there's three things that are different today that cast the CEO in a different light. You know, one is the government in the financial crisis and COVID infused an incredible amount of money into the economy, and that doesn't come for free. You know, in other words, you like to think you're a private institution. Nobody is really today. You know, the government is your partner. They've infused an incredible amount of capital, and so people in the country expect different behavior. So that's number one. I think number two is just social media, like all of the ways that employees and the public have to access in a meaningful way. You know, Dee, I worked for GE for 35 years. I can't remember, really, I can count on one hand the number of inside leaks in 35 years on one hand. Now there's 20 a day. You know?
Well, they all came from NBC. We can do that.
Exactly. You know, so employees don't keep their mouth shut. Nobody keeps their mouth shut. There's just so much more conversation about every company. And then I just think the third is, it's hard to look at our political system and say it's normal, right? In other words, people say, well, let's look at where we agree. There is no agreement, right? So in some ways, business leaders kind of have to be in the middle of the road on a lot of stuff. So they're viewed as being problem solvers in ways that used to be the government would be the problem solver. So I think those three things just make the role different. I always say, CEOs are the reactor. The world is the actor, right? What happens in politics and what happens in technology, that's the main action. And then CEOs have to react to that. And so I think you're seeing CEOs react to a world where more is expected of them, particularly on the social side.
But you always saw government as a critical partner. But is that because you were running an industrial company? So I'm sure, the CEO of Boeing, the CEO of, they all know that they need the government as a critical partner, or because this is new, I think, for a lot of consumer companies.
Yeah, no, for sure, particularly for consumer companies. But look, if you're in the aviation sector, the healthcare sector, financial services, you always knew that what happened in Brussels or Washington or Beijing was particularly important, and you had to pay attention to it. I live on the West Coast now. I'd say for 30 years, you could sit on the West Coast, you could sit in tech and basically pay no attention, give the government kind of short attention, right? That's changing now as well. There's going to be regulation happens in that sector as well. So, it's just, I was taught to respect it, but now it's just completely intrusive in every part of the economy. And that's, I don't think you can deny that. It's just the residue of a couple big crises we've had to get through.
Yeah, and although that's a challenge for business, really to get to overcome these major issues that we have in the world, income inequality is what you really need all of these stakeholders working on it, right? I mean, you need government, you need business, you need all sorts of stakeholders, NGOs, et cetera. But how agile do you think CEOs should be? So a big issue comes down, what's your thought process in, how do you respond quickly but authentically? How do you do an analysis? A lot of companies came out and said, we support Black Lives Matter, but then when you really analyze their own house, they had cleaning to do, right?
I think companies have to be looking through like 4 different filters. The one is, as a CEO, what do I believe in? What am I passionate about? In other words, we're allowed to have beliefs and passions. The second one is, where am I credible? In other words, you can speak if you're a CEO, but nobody's going to listen to you if your own track record stinks. So where am I credible? You have to have a long-term view. Okay, I'm watching the news this morning. Texas is now putting in a new voting rights law. If you protested Georgia, are you going to protest Texas? And are you going to work your way around the country? And then the last thing, D, is I think you have to make it personal. As an outsider today, but even when I was in the game, I sometimes signed petitions with 300 signatures. This is going to take people by surprise, but I don't think those mean as much as one CEO who stands up and says, this is what I think, right? And is willing to do it individually. During the Georgia voting law issues, I particularly read Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier, who are fine. I think they're credible. They stood singularly and had a voice, and I just think that matters the most, right? So what do you believe in? What are you credible with? Do you have a long-term view, and can you make it personal? If those 4 things you can check the box, you should speak up. Now, how quickly? I think CEOs need to have a communications team. We met with you and your communications team every month, and so we game boarded stuff before the shit hit the fan, right? So like if you're a CEO and you keep your communications team at arm's length, or you just hire hired guns every time you want to say something, you're just not going to be agile enough. You can't be fast enough. You need a good, solid core of internal communicators.
The other thing that I've told people is you need to have you need to decide who the core group of deciders are, to sound like George Bush here. But if you start asking, every board member and every head of every business line, and so what's your, how do you think about that stakeholder group? Who do you?
I think it's completely, so again, I think it's your communicators and business leaders. And then you always have two or three trusted allies who you respected their voice, even when they played out a position, right? But look, I loved my general counsel, right? I loved Alex Demetria for Brackett Dennison or Ben.
There's a butt coming. There's a butt coming.
But they weren't the voice of the company. The general counsel is not the voice of the company. The CEO is, right? So I listened to their input, but I had my own ideas. And a lot of times when companies get in trouble, what I see to the outside world is a bunch of legal gobbledygook.
Totally.
And that's just unacceptable, particularly today when you're going to get picked apart anyhow. You might as well get picked apart with your own voice.
Yeah, I think that's one of the only times you got verbally mad at me was when I had said, "Oh, I went and the legal team reviewed it," and you were like, "Just do it." So you just do it yourself. What about? So I think like some of these decisions I feel like are easier than they feel because what are the company's values? Right? What is your employee base expect? So employee activism today, I mean, this in the Valley is in San Francisco area is just massive, right? Walkouts. And so what do you need to do for your employee base? And I think that was a big consideration for you, right? If
completely,
just how do we show the African-American network or our women's group that like we stand with them?
Dee, so you go back to the first 3 months of the Trump administration, a Muslim travel ban. Okay, that came out within the first hour. You and I had drafted and released, our stance that we disagreed. Right now, why? We had 30,000 Muslim employees. We were deep in the region. We had done our homework. We knew the elements of it. Mm-hmm. When we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, I spoke individually about that, right? Because for a decade before that, we had invested in clean technology. Like, I think I guess I gauged our own team first, our own employees first. And if you'd asked people for a decade to invest in clean technology, you can't shut up about that stuff, right? You've got to be active in it. But other times, I think you can choose to sit out. Like, for instance, right now, I think one that's really hard is what do you say about China, right? Because if you're a business leader, you sit there and say, look, the two biggest economies in the world can't be at war with one another over the long term. It can't work that way, right? But at the same time, COVID is a big issue. The cyber is a big issue. IP protection is a big issue. So you don't want to get in the way of a very important debate, but at the same time, look, if you believe in climate change, if you believe it's existential, it's going to be solved by China more than the US, right? So you've got to be realistic and practical. So I think China is one of those that's quite hard for a communicator or a CEO to decide how to navigate that one right now.
Yeah, and many companies are living this right now with the Uyghur cotton issue, and some companies that we at Edelman have been talking to and helping, right? And how do you satisfy the American consumer, but still operate in China in whatever form that is? So that is, I think, probably one of the most complicated.
Really complicated and really important. I think not just for business, but for the world, that these two countries figure it out. But it's a hard one to navigate.
Yeah. I mean, part of this is saying the right thing to do is always the right thing to do, right? So finding a way to do the right thing without inflammatory language, or sometimes that's behind closed doors and not a big.
Look, I'd say also, Deidre, is like, you should always do the right thing, but at the same time, you want to influence others. It's hard to influence others if you don't have a good track record yourself, right? And so I think in many ways, if it comes to diversity inside a company, look, every other business leader knows what other companies are doing in terms of diversity. And I would say, the voices from the West Coast as it comes to diversity, they're not that strong, right? Because their track record isn't that good. And I look at a company like Pepsi. Pepsi has had great diversity results for 20 years or 30 years. So if the CEO of Pepsi, if Indra would say something, everybody'd sit back and listen because their own track record had been spectacularly good. So I think you just have to keep in mind as a matter of fact that people don't follow those who speak but haven't done it on their own time.
Yes, and that voice of authentic transparency. So you brought up Indra. So she's the type that would say, this worked really well, this didn't.
Yep.
Right? Like very authentic and transparent. So talking about China and linking that all in, that's a good segue into systems thinking. So you've been teaching at Stanford, and you talk a lot about, and you talk to your students about systems thinking and how do you become a systems leader. And I think this is critical in this discussion, don't you? Because that is connecting the dots is such a, so to just help people understand a little bit what you mean by that. And is that something you can learn, or are you just born a systems thinker?
Yeah, we better hope you can learn it. You know, we kind of talk about it, Dee, in terms of systems thinking is the and old strategy is the or, right? In other words, I have to pick one business or one function or one country. Today, most effective businesses do more than one thing well. They're digital and industrial. They're global and local. They make a profit and they are good socially, right? And so that's a lot about what we teach in our class. You know, this year we had the CEO of Peloton was one of our guest CEOs, right? And
I'm obsessed, Peloton. Yeah. Okay.
who would think media company, logistics company, exercise company, and they built this incredible franchise and are changing the world. So that's what we want our students to see that systems thinkers can be. And I just think, kind of legacy companies, I blame myself and others of my generation. We were too narrow sometimes. When you look at how tech in the last 20 years has really driven most of the change in the world, I think we all have to open it. So that's what we try to teach in systems thinking is try to operate on more than one dimension at the same time. Try to think over more than one time horizon as you're doing it. And I guess most of the new business books are kind of addressing this in some way, shape, or form. And that's what we're trying to do with our students. But sometimes it's best to pick an example. Peloton is a great example. I could name others.
Yeah, and if you have questions, drop them into the chat and we'll answer the questions. Yeah, I mean, I think that relates directly to this, because when you're thinking about what do I say about the Georgia voting law, right? You connecting all those dots. I know it's different than, do I buy this business? Do I build or buy it? Do I do this or that? But connecting all those dots is critical. I think that's a big mistake that people make, is slap on your website a statement about the Uyghur, situation in China before there's a thought process on all of the stakeholders that are going to see that.
And I think it's, again, thinking about it over the long term, right?
Yeah.
I think you could have anticipated voting rights in this country would be a big issue even before the last election, and that you should have a point of view on it, right? And companies need to be thinking in that anticipatory way about where the issues of China, what you said, the Uyghur issue, in China, things like that, wealth discrepancy, wage disparity. You need to be kind of anticipating that those are going to be the things that people think about. And going back to systems thinking, we always teach a class that typically we do it with a healthcare company about how businesses intersect in a broader context, right? Mm-hmm. Are you a public good? Are you a for-profit business? And the answer is you're a little bit of both, right? So you have to be very comfortable navigating both of those as you go through it. And we always try to build one class around that. We have we have media companies sometimes that come in and say, okay, are you here for a public good? Are you here, if you're running CNN, are you here just to do news? And it's always healthy debates, but that's what the world's going to be like.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have business performance, right? I mean, that's kind of table stakes. I think people say, well, I'm just focusing on my business. Yes, and.
Yes. It's just not good enough. So I would say the door swings both ways. Like people that think, so activist investors have never had more money than they have right now, right? So if you say, okay, all I'm going to do is run it for the public and not investors, you're going to get fired, right? By the same token, if you say what the public thinks about my company, if I make money, that's another thing, you're still going to get fired. So if you're a business leader today, there's like 7 ways to get fired. You're going to have to navigate through all of them.
Yeah. So someone's asking, do you have an example of when you chose not to speak up?
Yeah, I think, lots of times around China, I would kind of not pick a side, not take a public position. If anything, I would buck the current on public position. So that's, the global stuff I think is hard. I always, let's put it this way. I typically would view every situation first through the eyes of our employees and kind of put myself in their shoes and how they would think about it. So that's probably the prime example of when I decided not to speak up.
And people, it's good to remember too, there's soft diplomacy, right? So you may say things in a meeting with a senior member of the party in China that you don't put in a press release and say,
for sure. No, for sure. I mean,
yeah.
Again, I think it's it's a function of where are you credible and how you spend your time. By the time I ended my career at Deidre, I knew more about how the markets worked in countries like Saudi Arabia or China or Europe than the U.S. politicians did, really.
Yeah.
So when I started, that wasn't true. By the time I retired, so I think a lot of CEOs are actually deep domain experts, and there's not much they can do, to kind of get on one side or the other politically. And then I would just say, I think in DC over time, I narrowed down the number of issues that I worked on, because what I found is if you're into everything, nobody listens to you.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to do a lot on global trade, but I didn't do much on tax policy. I didn't do much on healthcare reform and things like that, just because I felt like, our counterparty, which would be a senator or vice president, something like that, they would just say, hey, look, you're going to do this, but keep your mouth shut on other stuff. We just don't want to see you every time.
And that was a unique position for a company like GE, of course, because many companies are so focused in like one lane, even if they have a lot of different products. So it's just there's very few companies that could play that broadly, right? So you had to make choices to focus. So we have ex-GE people asking questions, which is super fun. Hello, everybody. What are the soft skills a leader needs to navigate the current landscape?
Oh, look, I think it's a combination of kind of good listening skills so that you really kind of pick up what's on people's minds. You've got to build process around communication so that you're not surprised or caught flat-footed by things. And then you need the trust of your team. In other words, the whatever strength I had as a leader, or any CEO, whatever strength they have, is really built on the teams that they lead. The fact that we had, 150,000 employees in the U.S. times 7 or 8 in terms of our supply chain, that million-person cohort, that's what made me credible. And the extent to which they trusted me or we had a connection, that's important. So trust, great listening skills, and really disciplined process around, bringing people into the tent. You learn how to communicate and how to communicate.
It's a difficult leadership balance, right? Because you want people, and you want people to know you're standing behind them, but you want to leave them to do their work as it's kind of a mixture of both, right? Leave them alone, but you give them the support you need. Looking back at your GE time, was the one thing you would have done to be more nimble while remaining global and local?
Oh gosh, I would say two things. One was really kind of get out ahead of some of the big waves of nationalism. I think we did that reasonably well, but you could see this coming for 10 or 15 years. President Trump didn't invent nationalism. He just Americanized it, but it was going on for a long time. And then the other thing is, I wish we had spent more time training another 15 leaders inside the company who could communicate when I wasn't there. Because the fact is, in 185 countries, with a company as vast as we were at the time, one person communicating all the time just is not an effective way to do it. You need to make sure the messages get resonated. And I would have done more group strategizing around communications versus just being in the center of it myself.
So let's end on fear, because in Stanford, in the book, you talk about the concept of absorbing fear, which feels more relevant than ever. In a moment of crisis or great change, some people, you said, are fear accelerators and some are fear shock absorbers. I think this is such a relevant question because I've talked to CEOs in my current role privately who are definitely, they may not say articulate it this way to me, but they are afraid. They are afraid that you stick your head out, you get it chopped off. And so that fear is paralyzing. And you can apply that to, again, whether it's should I buy this business or whether it's should I fire this person, it's paralyzing. So tell me a little more about your thoughts on that from the
Yeah, I would say move forward. In other words, try to find a way to solve problems and move forward. Now, don't worry about being perfect. Like in a crisis, there's no style points. It's a pass-fail test. And so be willing to kind of lean forward to solve problems. I remember, Deirdre, in 2016, there were some shootings of both police with African Americans and vice versa. And I called on a Saturday morning the senior African American leader in GE at that time and said, "Hey, how you doing? How's your family? How you feeling? What can we do that's tangible to help?" Right? And from that, we developed, like, how would we take GE's training programs and allow the police department in Atlanta to leverage our training programs and things like that. Now, that's just a small example of taking something that is a crisis and trying to just one person, one city, one time, take steps to move forward in a solution, right? And maybe that didn't work, or maybe you could try other things. And I just don't see enough of people really trying to solve problems. It's too easy to point fingers, too easy to give speeches, but every one of your clients is big enough and smart enough that they could take one tangible step that would and leverage their best resource, which is their people, to make the world a better place. And I just don't see enough of that.
Yep. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing this, and thank you everyone for joining. We'll see you next time.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.